The sudden collapse. David Reed always thought his life was a quietly beautiful portrait. A wife he trusted, a son he adored, and the steady comfort of suburban routines. The sunrise filtered through the bedroom window that morning like any other, casting soft yellow stripes across the comforter he and Sarah had chosen together from a catalog 8 years ago. The familiarity was soothing, almost lulling him into forgetting how fragile such a piece could be. He'd left for work early. Sarah was still sleeping, her dark hair framing her face as their son Ethan's soft breathing drifted through the cracked open door of the next room. For a brief moment, David stood there in the hallway, caught in the perfect quiet of a household at rest. He whispered a promise to himself. Tonight, he'd be home on time. Maybe they'd order Thai, watch a movie, and laugh about how much Ethan hated broccoli. But the day had other plans. It started with small things, messages from Sarah that went unanswered, a call to her cell that rang out with no reply. By lunchtime, David had convinced himself she was just busy, maybe running errands or caught up with Ethan's school obligations. Still, a cold knot of worry grew in his stomach as the hours ticked on. He tried her again at 3, and again at 5, only to be greeted by silence. Something was wrong, really wrong. That evening, the house felt heavier than usual when he unlocked the door. The lights in the living room were off. He found Ethan in his room, hunched over a tablet, headphones clamped tight, oblivious to the world. "Is your mom home?" David asked gently, but Ethan just shrugged, not looking up. David walked through the rooms, calling her name softly, then louder. He felt foolish, his voice echoing in empty spaces. Then a vibration from his phone startled him. A new message flickered on the screen. Sarah, but not the words he expected. "I think we need to talk. I'm not coming home tonight. Please don't look for me." His hands trembled. He tried to call, but she didn't pick up. 1,000 terrible scenarios scrambled for space in his mind. He searched the house. Her closet was half empty, the drawers left ajar, her perfume still thick in the air. On the kitchen counter, a single key that's humming an innocent tune brought him back. David pressed the note flat on the counter, his palm slick with sweat. The house suddenly felt like it wasn't his anymore, a stranger's domain, rewritten in an instant. He sat at the kitchen table, silent as the sun dipped below the horizon, and let the first shock settle in. Nothing would ever be the same again. The legal maelstrom. The days after Sarah's departure bled together in a surreal blur. David floated through each one in a fog, barely eating, barely sleeping, his mind replaying her note and the hollow spaces she'd left behind. But no amount of heartbreak could prepare him for the storm that was about to sweep in. It started with a knock at the door, sharp and official, echoing through the house like a warning shot. David wiped his hands on his jeans, heart hammering, and opened it to find a courier in a pressed blue uniform. "Mr. David Reed?" He barely managed a nod before the man pressed a thick envelope into his hands. "You've been served." Inside, the words blurred before his eyes. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Legal terminology leapt off the page: custody, assets, grounds for divorce. David ran his hands through his hair, nausea rising. Sarah had moved fast, striking with a precision he never would have expected. Over the following weeks, the house became a battlefield of phone calls and paperwork. His phone rang with numbers he didn't recognize: her attorney, the court, a steely-voiced woman from Child Protective Services. Sarah's lawyer, sophisticated in both tone and strategy, painted David as an absent husband, too wrapped up in work to notice his family's unhappiness. Allegations, whispered at first, then spelled out, suggested that David's late hours and stony silences amounted to emotional neglect. He was blindsided. He hired a lawyer of his own, on the frantic recommendation of a friend. Rebecca Chang was sharp-eyed and unsentimental, quick to point out the dangers of letting emotion cloud judgment. She translated legalese into harsh reality. Sarah was seeking sole custody of Ethan, the house, and half, if not more, of everything they'd built. David sat stunned in Rebecca's sleek office, city towers gleaming behind her as she mapped out his dwindling prospects. You need to prepare yourself. Understand. Anything but the legal process chewed up their history, spat it out as lines on a page. Every warm memory reduced to an exhibit or a bargaining chip. The weeks crawled by, each one marked by another small defeat. The judge, an aging man with sharp glasses and a tired voice, listened as Sarah's lawyer recounted her version of their marriage, his late hours, her loneliness, Ethan's confused questions. The verdict stung, but felt inevitable. David lost the house. He was granted visitation every other weekend, barely enough to watch Ethan grow, much less to parent. Paperwork accumulated, court-ordered parenting classes, lists of approved locations for visitations, an endless stream of forms, signatures, and waiting rooms with magazines no one actually read. David's savings bled away, trickling into legal bills and child support he could barely afford. Through it all, Ethan's world shrank to fit inside a duffel bag that moved between houses. Each handoff was stiff, awkward, a forced performance for whoever was watching. David's morning started and ended in silence now. At night, he paced the empty kitchen, trying to remember the feeling of home before all the trust had drained away. In the court's eyes, he was now only a visitor, a shadow passing through his own family story. It wasn't anger that filled him as much as loss, a hollow ache where his life used to be. But somewhere beneath the grief, resentment began to burn, a slow, cold fire. This wasn't the end. He promised himself that. He wouldn't let this be all that remained of his story. In the weeks after the court's ruling, David moved through life like a man underwater. Everything distorted, his movements slow and deliberate, as if even gravity had grown heavier. The rented apartment he'd scrambled to find was a far cry from the house he'd lost, a cramped second-floor walk-up, the paint peeling, and the refrigerator humming in protest against the years. Nights stretched endlessly. They offered no comfort, only space for what-ifs and regrets to crawl backward and forward in his mind. Most evenings, he sat on the edge of a mattress that was still stiff from unpackaging, his hands pulling at loose threads as he stared at Ethan's empty twin bed on the other side of the room. Legal steps, but he barely heard her. He nodded when necessary, his mind drifting. His once promising job performance tanked. He arrived late, missed deadlines, and stared out the office window for long stretches, seeing only flashes of memories. Ethan's laughter, echoing on a chilly Saturday morning, Sarah's head on his shoulder in those rare, perfect nights. Sometimes, after dropping Ethan off at Sarah's, David would drive aimlessly along the outskirts of the city, numb with misery. There were nights he found himself parked on a dark overlook, just sitting there, hands clenched on a steering wheel, the world feeling impossibly small and too wide all at once. He wondered if anyone would notice if he just vanished. The loneliness gnawed at him until it turned into something mean. Even food lost its taste. He ate to survive, not for pleasure, the fridge filled with takeout containers and expired milk. Sleep came fitfully, always chased away by dreams of laughter cut short, of doors closing, of Ethan's small hands slipping from his. One night, as a storm battered the city, David slumped on the worn couch, an open beer sweating in his hand. He stared into the darkness outside, his reflection faint in the window, an unrecognizable ghost of the man he'd been. The phone vibrated. He hoped for a miracle, a message from Ethan or some sign of hope, but it was only a bank notification, another bill overdue. It felt like the last straw. The thought of giving up crept in, slow and seductive, but something stopped him. A half-remembered promise, or maybe just the stubborn core that had carried him through the first devastating weeks. The memory of Ethan's arms around his neck, the feel of the boy's heartbeat thumping against his chest, his father's voice from long ago telling him, "Real strength isn't never falling, it's getting back up." That voice cracked through the fog. With shaking hands, David called his own father for the first time in weeks. The older man listened quietly to David's halting words, then replied with gentle certainty. "You're still Ethan's dad. That can't be taken away. Not by any court, not even by yourself." Their conversation was brief, but afterward David sat a long time in silence, the words echoing in the quiet apartment. Rock bottom wasn't where he'd wanted to be, but maybe here, with nothing left to lose, halting step at a time. He started with the smallest changes. He cleaned the apartment, tossing out old takeout containers and organizing the piles of mail. He shaved. He finally replied to messages from coworkers and called his sister back. The world, he discovered, hadn't stopped for his pain. Bills still needed paying. His landlord still expected rent. Ethan still asked, between bites of pizza, about the stars and dinosaurs, and the big, sprawling future only children could imagine. A help wanted sign in a small coffee shop window caught David's eye on a rainy Wednesday. He paused, thought of his thinning savings, and swallowed his pride. The application was brief: past experience, a short interview with a kind-eyed manager, and a handshake. It paid less than his old job, but the work was grounding. He learned to make cappuccinos and clean the steamer, memorized regulars' orders, and discovered a quiet pride in the simple act of showing up. The job came with unexpected benefits. The other baristas, college kids and single moms, never pried about his past. They pulled him into clumsy banter and inside jokes. Sometimes, when the shift was slow, he shared stories with a gray-haired customer named Mr. Thompson, who told him that a man's worth isn't measured by the home he lives in, but the courage he shows when life falls apart. These small moments chipped away at the sense of failure clinging to David's back. At his lowest, he'd felt invisible. But now, strangers greeted him by name, and every paycheck felt like a small victory. He even found himself smiling unexpectedly as he stocked pastries or handed a regular their usual. There were setbacks, too. Sometimes grief surged up unannounced, like when he saw a happy couple at a sidewalk table, or when Ethan asked, "Why can't you come home with me tonight?" But there were more good days than bad, slowly, almost imperceptibly, outnumbering the dark ones. One Friday after closing, a coworker invited him to join a group for pizza. David hesitated, then agreed. Their laughter was easy, the conversation aimless and warm. He went home that night not with the ache of isolation, but step. He wanted to do more than just exist. The spark of ambition, the one he thought Sarah's betrayal had extinguished, began flickering back to life. He started spending his evenings at the local library, scrolling through online classes and job boards. He signed up for a business management course, unsure if he still had the discipline or drive to finish anything. The material was tough, but it pulled his mind away from regret and into the future. What started as an obligation became a genuine interest. He stayed late, poring over assignments and taking careful notes, feeling his confidence return bit by bit. At work, his manager, Linda, noticed the change. She was the kind of boss who remembered birthdays, who saw when someone was struggling, and who offered guidance without judgment. One afternoon, she caught David before the lunch rush, her face kind but serious. "You work hard, David," she said. "You're a fast learner. If you're interested, we have a shift supervisor position opening soon." Surprised, David hesitated, but Linda encouraged him. "Sometimes people need a fresh start. You've earned it." The promotion wasn't glamorous, a few extra dollars an hour, some headaches with scheduling, but it was more than a job. It was a statement to himself. He was capable, worthy, and moving forward. Linda became a mentor. When David struggled to balance work and his online classes, she adjusted his shifts. She talked him through difficult customers and reminded him that leadership was about listening as much as it was about giving orders. Under her guidance, David learned to be steady under pressure and to see challenges as problems to solve, not evidence that he was failing. David's world continued growing beyond the shop, too. He started jogging in the mornings, headphones blasting music that made him feel powerful. On weekends with Ethan, he planned mini adventures, trips to the park, science museums, and sometimes just blanket forts made on his apartment floor. His son's laughter reminded him that their story, fractured as it was, could still be filled with joy. Some nights, of course, regret crept in. The wounds of the past were slow to close, and shadows lingered. But when he looked in the mirror, David hardly recognized the broken man who couldn't get out of bed only a month before. He was standing taller now, filled out a little more, pride, yet never filled the hollow inside his chest. The past clung to him like a shadow, whispering reminders that some wounds weren't so easily healed. It was especially acute on quiet nights, once Ethan was asleep. Alone, David sometimes found himself staring at old photographs stored on his phone. Images of laughter, family vacations, and birthdays flickered by like scenes from a life that belonged to someone else. The ache of loss was sharp, often twisting into questions he couldn't answer. Did Ethan blame him? Had Sarah ever loved him at all? Would things ever feel whole again? David learned to function with the pain, but he couldn't ignore the emptiness left by missing half of his son's childhood. The awkwardness at every handover, the way Ethan sometimes cast nervous glances between his parents, reminded him of the price everyone had paid for choices not entirely his own. One gray Saturday, David headed to the grocery store after his shift, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of bills and lesson plans. He moved mechanically through the aisles, tossing items into his basket and barely nodding hellos to familiar faces. Near the frozen foods, a soft giggle made him freeze. He turned, heart in his throat. There stood Sarah, her face paler than he remembered, one hand on Ethan's shoulder. The boy's brown hair, so like his own, fell messily across his brow. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The world seemed to slow, sound falling away, leaving only the painful thud of David's heartbeat. Sarah's eyes were startled, wary, as if unsure whether to smile or retreat. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing up at his father with a complicated look that was part longing, part fear, and part confusion. The three of them stood rooted, as if at the edge of some invisible line they were all terrified to cross. "Hi," David said softly, voice a little too hoarse. "Hi, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice hopeful but uncertain. They traded small talk about school and work, each word brittle and weighted by everything left unsaid. Sarah maintained a polite distance, never quite meeting David's gaze. David wanted desperately to reach out, to smooth his son's hair or joke like he used to, but they may no longer bleed, but they ache in quiet, persistent ways. They transform a man, make him careful with his hope and humble in his joys. But even as he accepted the pain, he clung fiercely to the love that still tied him to his son and to the possibility that someday even haunted hearts could find peace. Time, relentless as tides, pressed forward. For once, instead of being swept under by the current, David found himself rising with it. The efforts he'd invested over countless difficult months began to bear fruit, though the change was less a sudden revelation and more a slow, rewarding climb. At the coffee shop, Linda handed him the keys one morning and simply said, "You're opening alone tomorrow. You've earned my trust." The gesture jolted David with pride. Trust, once shattered so thoroughly at home, felt like a currency more valuable than money. Customers greeted him by name. The team relied on his steady presence. Even Linda, usually reserved, confided that she hadn't intended to hire another supervisor, but David had redefined what potential looked like. Meanwhile, his business management course concluded with David at the top of his cohort. When the certificate arrived, he smoothed it gently into a frame and placed it on his nightstand, across from Ethan's homemade drawings. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel accomplished. The ripple effects of his persistence spread beyond work and school. At the community center, where he sometimes volunteered to keep busy, his story reached young men navigating their own storms, people facing broken homes, failed dreams, and fear of the future. David never delivered speeches, but he listened, offering encouragement that didn't feel empty because he'd survived his own abyss. Word spread of his resilience. A local newspaper ran a feature, and parents arrived at the cafe just to shake his hand, telling him he was a reminder that broken beginnings didn't mean hopeless endings. Even as his life accelerated, shadows from the past remained. One afternoon, over lunch with Mr. Thompson, the kindly regular, David heard whispers about Sarah. It was muted, secondhand gossip at first. Her new relationship wasn't going as planned. The business venture with her partner had faltered. Money grew tight. Friends she'd once counted on stopped returning her calls. The perfect life she'd hoped for seemed to be unraveling. Suspended moment. David didn't think about loss or betrayal. He saw only possibility. His reward, he realized, was the man he'd become and the hope he inspired in others. With every handshake, every thank you, every child's laughter echoing inside the shop, David knew the narrative had shifted. He was no longer defined by tragedy, but by the victory of having remade himself through sheer will. And as the sun set in a splash of gold over the city skyline, he let himself believe, truly believe, that a new chapter was his to write. The downfall of the betrayers. The city's endless buzz went on, indifferent to heartache, but inside Sarah's new apartment, so much smaller than the one she'd left with such anticipation, silence had become the dominant note. The sparkling excitement that once animated her face faded, replaced by lines of exhaustion and regret. The big dream she had painted with her lover seemed to thin and fray with each passing day. Her lover, Mark, had been charming when things were easy. Now, under the weight of overdue bills, missed payments, and daily arguments, his charisma dulled to resentment. Their savings shrank. Plans to start a boutique collapsed. The joy of forbidden love surrendered to stress. What once felt intoxicating now tasted bitter and stale. Sarah found herself snapping more often, at Mark, at the world, at herself. They argued late into the night, voices muffled but sharp enough for the neighbors to complain. She scrolled her phone endlessly, searching for jobs and old friends, but replies were infrequent and stiff. The story she had told, that David had been the villain, didn't hold up under scrutiny for long, and the friends she'd leaned on peeled away, one uncomfortable revelation at a time. Mark spent more nights out with friends, coming home smelling of cheap whiskey and regret. Sometimes she lay awake, watching the patterns of passing headlights crawl along the ceiling, trembling with the realization that she was more alone now than she'd ever been in her marriage. Word of their unraveling traveled quietly through mutual acquaintances. Some, who once sided with Sarah out of loyalty or convenience, began to reconsider. Her parents, after months of tense silence, stopped calling altogether. Even her brother, always her defender, voiced disappointment she hadn't heard from him before. Through it all, David kept his distance. He heard enough from friends and the quiet murmur of trample over her sorrows, or to save her from them. Among the ashes of Sarah and Mark's collapse, a few who truly cared, her childhood friend, the neighbor who had once admired Mark, reached out, quietly expressing dismay at what she'd become. There was no more talk of new beginnings, only hushed admissions that happiness, when purchased with betrayal, rarely lasted. David observed it all from afar, choosing grace over vengeance. His own wounds remained, but distance and dignity had become his shield. Even those who had doubted him now recognized the depth of his strength, not just to survive, but to rise, untouched by bitterness. And though Sarah's story twisted into sorrow and regret, David kept his eyes fixed ahead, determined never to lose himself in the wreckage behind him. The first confrontation. The knock on David's door came late one gray, drizzly afternoon. The thud was tentative, as if the person on the other side wanted to take it back but couldn't. David considered ignoring it. Most of his visitors called first these days. But something in the quiet, insistent rhythm drew him from the comfort of his worn couch. He opened the door and found Sarah standing beside Mark, both of them looking smaller than he remembered. Sarah's eyes were ringed with fatigue, and Mark's bravado had melted into a sullen, uncertain frown. There was nothing of the easy confidence from before, only desperation threaded through their posture and glance. "David," Sarah managed. She hesitated, tightening her grip on her purse. Mark looked down at his shoes, unable or unwilling to meet David's gaze. David stepped aside but said nothing, his presence calm and unreadable. The air seemed to hum with all the words unspoken, with years of heartbreak and bitterness that suddenly felt so distant. He didn't need them anymore. He let the silence work. We just wanted to talk," Sarah pressed on, voice trembling. Things have been hard." Mark cleared his throat.
Forgiveness, perhaps just understanding. But David's face remained composed. He wasn't cruel, but he was immovable. "I wish you both luck," he said, his voice gentle but final. "But I have a new life now, a son to care for, a future to work toward. That chapter for me is closed." For a moment, no one moved. The hush in the hallway was so profound that the world outside seemed impossibly distant. Rain tapping softly at the windows, the distant hum of traffic, the wrinkles of old scars uncoiling within his chest. Mark turned away first, muttering a "thank you," so faint it barely counted. Sarah lingered a moment longer, her eyes shining with tears she fought to hide. She wanted to say something, but David's quiet strength made words impossible. Finally, she nodded and left. David closed the door behind them and leaned against it, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He felt no triumph, no vindication, only relief, a wave of quiet freedom that left him lighter than he'd been in years. He realized at last how much he'd changed, not just to survive what they'd done, but to become the person who could let go with dignity and never look back. After the confrontation with Sarah and Mark, something restless in David finally settled. He could feel the finality in his bones, a door firmly closed behind him. But as one chapter shut, another quietly, hesitantly began. It was with Ethan, always Ethan, that the next story was being written. He saw his son every other weekend. At first, these visits were awkward, careful things, like both of them were handling fragile glass neither wanted to break. Ethan would disappear into his room or watch TV with the volume too loud, wary and withdrawn. But David refused to let frustration win. He read every book he could find about children and divorce, how trust, once broken, took time and constancy to repair. So he stayed gentle, offering invitations instead of demands. He bought the same brand of cereal Ethan liked before, kept the apartment stocked with art supplies, and made room for silences when words seemed overwhelming. "I'm glad you're here," he'd say softly, even when Ethan wouldn't meet his eyes. It was the small things that changed first. One Saturday morning, no matter what had been lost. Still, there were moments when Ethan pulled away, questions written plain across his face. Why couldn't things be like before? Did his dad still love him the same way? David never pushed for answers, but he was always there with an open ear, even if the only words exchanged were, "I'm here for you, no matter what." One night, as a thunderstorm rumbled outside, Ethan tiptoed from the couch and buried himself against David's side. They sat in silence,
the steady beat of rain a lullaby in the darkness. "Dad?" Ethan whispered, voice fragile. "Why did Mom leave?" David swallowed, choosing honesty and care. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he said quietly, "but none of it was your fault. And I will always be your dad. That's something no one can take away." Ethan nodded, tears glistening on his lashes, but his arms came around his father in a hug, tighter, truer than words could manage. In that instant, David felt a warmth bloom in his chest that no past pain could ever touch. Their bond was not what it used to be. In some ways, it was stronger. A love forged not from perfection, but from perseverance, patience, and the courage to rebuild, piece by piece. With every laugh, every shared victory, father and son stitched together their own tapestry of hope. And for David, that was the real measure of healing. Not in victories over the past, but in the soft, resilient heart of the boy he loved, now beating in time with his own. Failure and regret. Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table in a dim, silent apartment that seemed to shrink more every day. The only light came from the city's neon glow filtering between ragged drapes. The hum of the refrigerator was her company. All around her, the trappings of her new life. Unpaid bills, half-empty wine glasses, a closet with more space than clothes, testified to what had unraveled. Mark was gone. He had left 2 weeks ago, vanishing without a word into the night, taking what little they had saved and leaving only a brief, bitter note. "I can't do this anymore." When Sarah tried to call the friends who'd once supported her, their voices were strained and distant, dialing David's number. To her surprise, he answered, his voice steady but not unkind. They met at a quiet park at dusk, beneath the twisted, leafless branches of an old oak. Sarah hesitated, words bundled in her throat, until the silence pressed her to speak. "I'm sorry, David," she began, her voice trembling, eyes unable to meet his. "For everything. I thought I was chasing happiness, but I've lost everything. Mark is gone. My friends. Everyone's left. I have nothing left." David listened quietly, his face showing equal measures of sorrow and resolve. Sarah saw the pain she'd caused reflected there, but also a sense of someone who had survived and moved beyond it. She wiped at her eyes, voice cracking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to tell you. And Ethan, does he know?" David took a deep breath, steady and unhurried. "Ethan knows his mother loves him. That hasn't changed, Sarah. But he's been hurt, and so have I. Forgiveness." He trailed off, searching for words as the sky deepened behind them. "Forgiveness takes time. Sometimes it never really comes the way we want. But I hope you find peace. For yourself. For him." A long pause passed between them, filled with all the things they could not change. Sarah reached out, but her fingers hovered gingerly over David's hand before pulling away. "I wish I could go back," she whispered. "I wish I'd seen what I had." David nodded, his own memories flickering behind his eyes. "We all do, sometimes." With tears streaking down her cheeks, Sarah stood to go. She looked back only once, her face etched with grief and longing. David watched her recede into the twilight, feeling the ache of old wounds, but also the certainty that he had done all he could. In that fading light, Sarah's silhouette seemed to flicker, caught between what was lost and whatever future she would have to forge alone. For both of them, it was a painful chapter's end, marked not by harsh words, softened the hardest edges.
He had faced her, given her honesty and compassion, and then let go. No anger left, just a tired understanding that peace sometimes meant not reopening old wounds, even for the hope of reconciliation. That morning, David laced up his shoes. "Want to go for a walk?" he asked Ethan. "Can we bring my kite?" Ethan replied, his eyes shining. There was trust again in that gaze, fragile but real. They walked to the wide, windswept park together, David's hand resting on his son's shoulder, feeling the sturdy warmth of family rebuilt. The sky was impossibly blue, wind tugging playfully at Ethan's kite as it danced, tugging its string higher and higher. Their laughter mingled with the breeze, as light and free as the flight above them. While Ethan ran ahead, David paused beneath an old oak, the one where Sarah had once come to him in tears, and let himself breathe. He felt sorrow, yes, but also gratitude. The pain had shaped him, tested him, peeled away layers he never knew he had. What endured was his capacity to care, to hope, and to begin again. Later, on their walk home, Ethan looked up and asked, "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" David knelt down, gathering his son in a hug that was both promise and prayer. "Yes, buddy. We're more than okay. We're starting a new adventure." As dusk settled, they made dinner together and filled their small apartment with the sound of shared stories, budding dreams, and music on the old stereo. David felt each moment stretch and settle inside him, hope, peace, and the strength that comes from surviving the storm. He understood now. Life was not about erasing pain, but about finding meaning in resilience, about casting off the burdens of the past so something better could grow. Tomorrow's sunrise would bring its own set of joys and hardships, but David was ready. He'd made peace with his scars and embraced the gift of a second chance. And in the gentle glow of their kitchen that night, as Ethan leaned against him and the world outside spun quietly on, David at last